1350, what we know as the idyllic French countryside was a living hell. For more than 15 years, the people had suffered at the hands of English invaders. Little did they know that this war would last for another 100 years. But through this crucible of fighting, famine and plague, there would emerge the modern nation of France. England's King Edward III looked jealously across the English Channel. Wanting France for his own, he had added the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, to his own royal standard. This was an all-out declaration of war. And in 1337, he invaded. But France already had a king, Philippe VI. As the English burned their way across the land, Philippe's army and his legendary knights marched to meet them and came face to face with the English longbow. A simple weapon, but the most devastating the knights had ever faced. The heroes of France fell to storms of English arrows. The war engulfed the French countryside. By 1351, the conflict was focused on Brittany. One fight stands out as a spectacular display of chivalry and a symbol of the wider conflict between the two enemy nations. The Combat of the 30 is still commemorated here in Brittany. It was a dispute between two local families. Supported by the opposing sides in the war, the French and English commanders decided to settle it through a trial of knightly combat. Each side would choose 30 champions to fight on neutral ground. France prepared to defend itself against England's finest. Intent on ending the suffering of the French peasantry, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir sent a challenge to the English commander. 30 champions on each side would compete in a tournament for final claim to Brittany. With the battleground of the halfway oak agreed upon, Sir Jean set out to gather support from local knights. As a knight himself, Sir Jean followed the strict rules of chivalry and was expected to protect the local peasantry and ensure peace.
Dicte-moi ma besogne. L'heure est si comme vos adresses. Je suis votre serveuse.
Most medieval tournaments were friendly in nature, held for sport and glory, but the combat of the 30 was arranged between opponents mired in war. English raids had torn through the countryside of Brittany and brought great hardship to the people.
Incontinent. Acet vos arnois. Avant.
Sir Jean spotted an English raiding party attacking a nearby farmstead.
Je commande. Aveillez votre. Je suis votre serveuse.
French knights defeated the English raiders, and Sir Guy de Rochefort joined Sir Jean's party. Jean's search next brought him to Sir Geoffroy du Bois, whose squires were contending with a detachment of English longbowmen. The knights would use the great speed of their war horses to charge the archers and overwhelm them. The English longbowmen fell, but the French knights knew the enemy would attempt to retake the hilltop fortification and steeled themselves for further attacks. With Sir Geoffroy by his side, Sir Jean had secured the outpost. Looking to secure his honor, a young knight held his ground on a bridge in Sir Jean's path.
Obéir. Il se tient dans sa tire. Oh non, est-ce qu'obéir?
Honorably conceding defeat in the duel, Sir Yves Charel joined the cause.
Page et comprens. En l'avoué, preniez vos bagoues. Nos reverends qui meurtrir, comme vos plaistes. Si faites vos commandements. Laisse vos donc, en l'avoué.
Sir Jean entered the staging area for the tournament, where he prepared to choose which knights would join him in battle. Each knight would be accompanied by his squires, young nobles in training to become knights themselves. Sir Jean had selected his champions. As the sun rose, the two sides entered the arena, ready for the first round of combat. Claiming an easy victory in the first round, the French champions left the arena to recover their strength. Refreshed and reinvigorated, the French knights returned to the arena for another round of combat. The combat of the 30 was about to decide which nation would control the Duchy of Brittany. Triumphant, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir and his loyal knights claimed victory. The combat of the 30 had decided control of Brittany in favor of the French. Little did the two sides know This was just the beginning of a bitter war that would outlive them all. After victory at the Combat of the 30, the French faced devastating raids from England's Black Prince. But France's King John II was closing in. Jean finally caught the English near the city of Poitiers in September 1356. The French army outnumbered the English by thousands. King Jean himself joined the fight, but what seemed a certain victory for France soon turned into a nightmare. The English longbow devastated the mighty French army. An endless hail of arrows gutted the main French force. Then the English captured King Jean. The fight was over. The Battle of Poitiers was another catastrophic defeat for the French. The English had destroyed most of France's nobility in a single day. Now they turned their attention towards taking the French capital, Paris. The invaders marched unopposed towards Paris. The remains of some of the medieval walls of Paris still stand today. As the English army approached, the terrified locals sought shelter behind these defenses. Could France's capital withstand the full might of the Black Prince's army? The English Black Prince had raided the French countryside without mercy, and now his army had come for the capital. With the English on their doorstep, it fell to the French army and the people of Paris to defend the walls of their proud city. Hoping to avoid open battle, the French began fortifying the city, manning the walls and calling every available soldier to his post. As the French hastened their preparations, several detachments of English soldiers were spotted closing in on the city.
Je gagne mon gage, comme il vous plaise.
Besoigné après?
Chevalcheur, soyez prêts! Les chevalcheurs s'escoupent! Les chevalcheurs sont prêts!
On ne part pas! Suis sans soigner!
Chevalcheurs, soyez...
The English showed no mercy, burning their way to Paris via 3 routes, each of which was home to villages and farms that supplied the capital.
Reste pour la place, laisse-moi exploiter. Si, me volens.
Oyez les ordonnances. Manance, prest à volets. Por vos servi. Vajeți moje bez suis envoie. Toți dialogueți.
Acestos despartans, brăiemant.
Besoin à faire. Qu'est-ce donc? Aïe, messieurs de moi.
De vers oerfoltil archief.
Manans, reist over. Manans, en Jimmy.
Manance, offrance d'or, si vais exploiteur. Que faut-il donc de Manouer à souffle.
Longtemps battu demeurait. Vives exploitières. Je vos amène mes riens. Avance nos salaires. Marchiez rien moins, tres tous. À votre commandement. Envoyez un mestier des bois.
La demi-dosage, si! Que faut-il donc à votre commandement? Manouer assouvi. Belle œuvre.
Partez-moi mon Versailles.
Ça est belle manouer. Vajeți voi suis en Quemin.
Oh, annonce ça, tres tous.
Reste contraire.
Marchiez rien moins, tres tous.
Une note archi.
Archie demeure,
As the French continued to rally their army, the English took the last of the surrounding villages and had almost encircled Paris. Having struck out at the English front line, the French had slowed the enemy's advance.
Oil, si toast.
Les commandements viennent. préparé.
Sur quoi me faut-il faire?
Archère, de demeurer, Squins. Archère, à la voie. Archère, allons de paiement.
Je veux vous obéir.
And the English at the city gates. The French armies steeled themselves for battle. Now came the capital's true test, with the mighty walls of Paris hold against a fearsome English siege. The Parisian Guard raised the alarm as the English began their first assault on the city walls.
Soyez prêts, comme en votre service. Porte les avoirs.
Oil, i 13 la doit éclairer par
The French army fought valiantly, repelling the first English attack.
Besoin d'y faire? Ah, yes, nous devons. Lance devant nos salaires. Allons, ça, Trestuts. Giovanni Bastille.
L'heure incontinente. Attendez, laissez comme votre frère.
Archère, à la voie. Anti-Querpix, archère.
L'heure est service. Je suis votre serveur.
Archère, faites archère.
À la folle, chevalier. Thomas und
Compagnon, reste
Restus
Le verrou, faut-il archère.
Restus avant, compagnon.
Longtemps battu. Ça espelle, Manuel.
Attendez, je suis votre serveuse.
Advertens, tous oiets, tous le lors devant nos salaires. Lors bâtige c'est un besoin. Rappareillement en train. Rappareillement en train.
The French defense of their capital held firm, wearing down the English invaders one by one.
Advertans, lasset-moi exploiter. Bien oye. Dos dialores. Lors batige s'estui.
Besoin à faire.
Bon,
Oil, mestir des mouets. Bon, revoir servir. Oyez, les
que faut-il donc besoigner? Très petit destin. Bonne besoigne de fait.
Oil, mestir des... Annonce! Reprends-en! Annonce, manance!
Comme il vous plaît. Allez, de colle. En volontiers. À pointe
Si, comme volette. Vécure Mériens. Tous brillent à l'oreille.
Oyez, justement.
Oyez.
Si, comme volette. Véquière. Oyez, j'exploite les bombards.
The enemy grew ever more desperate as their ranks thinned and their hopes of victory faded.
Lors batige s'estui. Oyez, allons, s'adresse tous. Doncia Lores.
Si attendons.
Although the walls of Paris had been breached, the French could still hold the city, so long as its mighty landmarks did not fall.
L'or se bâtit, je s'estuie!
Defeated and demoralized by the strength of the French defense, the Black Prince's army abandoned their siege of the capital. Paris celebrated victory, but this was not the last test the French would face in their struggle to win the war. The walls of Paris held out against the English onslaught. England's King Edward and the Black Prince abandoned the siege. They marched towards Chartres to try their luck at conquering a less formidable target. But before they could attack, a violent storm hit the army. Killing 1,000 English soldiers in a tempest of hail and freezing winds. To Edward, this Black Monday disaster seemed like divine retribution. A sign that it was time to stop waging war and make peace with France's King Jean. But even as peace between kings was reached, the people of France were still living in bloodshed and turmoil. Between 1358 and 1370, France was in chaos. Peasant uprisings, rampaging bands of mercenaries, and civil war ravaged the country. Peasants rose in rebellion, killing their lords and wreaking havoc. Mercenary bands also roamed the land. Known as routiers, they had once been hired by the English to fight against the French, but were cut loose when peace was reached. They systematically ravaged and pillaged towns across France. And with King Jean prisoner in England, his son Charles the Dauphin faced homegrown attacks on his rule by powerful French lords, beset from all sides. The Dauphin's forces had to regain control over their own country. Having only recently been crowned King of France, Charles V dispatched his army to the French-held village of Évreux to forge order from chaos. From here, the army would move to extinguish three major threats. Bands of roving mercenaries harrying the countryside, a peasant uprising, and attacks from a rival for the French crown, Charles of Navarre. The French army would start by reclaiming the rebel-held villages of Cocherel, Jouy, and Croissy.
Tous audite. Sis homes. Lire faccio.
Mandesque.
Ecce li mandement. Restituo.
Quid labour.
Quid me. Laburo.
Parat pour Perfect. Escolte Pams de retournar. Parat pour la bourra. Toutes comme oui, mais. La bourse Pérance. L'irefat. La bourse Pérance.
Escolte bene. Lire faccio. Mandement, colonnes. Tous audite.
Et ci vamos, vale tous. Retourno con materia. Parat pour venir. Parat pour la bourra.
Quites in avant.
Mandesquid. La bourra enseignement. Sis homes. Quid me. Quito.
As the French army struggled to regain control of the countryside, they were struck by a band of English routiers. These mercenaries had been cut loose by the English army and were plundering the countryside in order to make a living. The French forces eliminated the routier attack, but more were still raiding the countryside in search of provisions and riches. The routier demanded payment from the French, or they would continue their horrifying raids.
Sis homes. Si bene. Io ma sono la cose.
Déférir l'ennemi.
The French discovered the routier hidden camp and could put an end to the English raids if they could destroy the camp.
Maudite.
Después de batalla!
With the Routier camp destroyed, mercenary attacks were no longer a threat. In taking the village of Jouy, the French army was closer to stemming the peasant rebellion and regaining control.
Mauvais, Tourbès. Ite férir l'ennemi.
Nom d'escouade, Quito. Pontier. Camitrenca.
Somes. Cose sera ma sonata.
The village of Poissy, rich in gold deposits, was a crucial town for the French to reclaim. The central monastery town of Cocherel would continue to send out rebel attack parties to weaken the French army. The French army defeated the rebels at Poissy and took control of the gold-rich village. The central monastery town of Cocherel was still under the control of rebel peasants. The French army would have to take it before they could launch an assault on Charles of Navarre.
Si, comprendo.
Parade pour venir. Merci, boys.
The French army took control of the rebel villages, and the peasant uprising was subdued.
Sommes en ordonnance. Pointe de merci pour l'ennemi.
But to keep control over the region, they would need to defend its center of influence, the monastery at Cocherel. Northeast of Cocherel, Charles of Navarre's army had established a fortified camp. The King of Navarre sought to make himself ruler of France as well. He intended to press his claim by destroying the newly arrived royal forces.
L'ors bâti de s'estuire. Toast de ya, Lauretz.
De l'ennemi! Commandement pour le chemin. Alors, Francis, j'attends.
Pushing up the hillside, the French discovered Charles of Navarre's camp.
Reste tous à l'arçon.
Na jetzt, moi, besoin. Annonce, noce de vente salaire.
Oh jetzt, tous le monde. On se tient à l'oreille.
The French army had repelled Charles of Navarre, stemmed the revolt, and held back the raids of the Routiers. In the struggle for control over France's lands, the king still clung to power. With rebels and raiders eliminated at Cocherel, King Charles V faced one last threat to France: the relentless English invaders. Word arrived that the English army was weak and scattered, divided by infighting. The king quickly directed his army to chase down the old enemy of France at Pontvalin. The French town of Pontvalin lay directly in the path of marauding English soldiers on the hunt for loot. The town's only hope of survival lay with the French forces camped nearby. The French quickly prepared to ambush the disorganized English raiders and defend Pontvalin from ruin.
Oh, mess, prépare.
Eccelimando.
Escolte bene. Zitto.
Ok.
Vuestre mandement? Si, comprendo.
Tous audite.
Vado por mercare.
The main English army thundered into the valley. They paused to rest beyond the town before launching their raid.
Entendo. Odi, obeyo. Parates, servientes.
Felice peare.
Seco materia.
The first group of English raiders began their attacks on the outlying farms. After destroying the farms, they would attack the town of Pontvalin.
Parates, servientes. Bene, bene. Odi, ambulance.
made their way towards Pontvalin.
Mauvais, Tourbès. Encueste de batalla. Mauvais, Tourbès.
Audite,
Ordine tenet. Seguite sin avant. Espero tu secund mandement. Si comprendo. Vado piuttosto. Come mondes. In avanti. Equite civiliens.
More scattered English raiders arrived and made their way towards Pontvalin.
Ordine tenet. Comprendo. Audite. Est facile, cavalier. Come mondes. Civiliers, attention. Equites in avant. Ocest. Ordine tenet. Secund mandement. Audite. Attention. Dorme bien. Despacito. Come mondes. Equites attendem come mondes. Des militaires. Orchestre. Dorme bien. Secund mandement. Audite. Equites. In avant. Equites attensi. Comprendo. Equites sul palco. Si voglio.
After a hard-won battle against a scattered enemy, the French succeeded in halting the English chevauchée at Pontvalin. The English army was not invincible. The French cause was not yet lost. The French won an overwhelming victory at the Battle of Pontvalin. It was the first time the English had been utterly defeated during the war. But the triumph was short-lived. As England spent the next 60 years amassing French territory through alliances and victories at great battles such as Agincourt. It seemed that nothing could stop England. Who then could have foreseen that a teenaged girl was about to change the course of history? In 1429, France was in dire straits. Nowhere was it more evident than the besieged city of Orléans. The city was completely surrounded by English-held forts. But just a few days' ride away, here in Chinon, there was potential help. The French royal prince, the Dauphin Charles, was holed up in his fortress and under pressure to ride out to save Orléans. As Charles hesitated, a young peasant girl arrived at his court. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. She claimed to have received saintly visions, giving her a divine task to help Charles become king and drive the English out of France forever. Charles was skeptical, but was soon convinced of her divinity. And he charged this 17-year-old with the near impossible mission to liberate Orléans. To Jeanne, this was the first step in realizing her God-given destiny. In April 1429, she rode out from Chinon at the head of her army to confront the hated enemy of France. Surrounded by English strongholds, and with its last line of defense under attack, the city of Orléans grew ever more desperate. In France's darkest hour, 17-year-old Jeanne d'Arc arrived with the king's army to liberate a city and prevent the fall of a nation.
Advertance, tout le monde. Hostia Lores.
Udouege fest vos commandements. Si fes comme dues. Perfecta la son.
Bonne
Si fecte sera. Je fes vos commandements. Ça, avant.
Besoin à faire.
Soyez express.
Compagnon, machette derrière. Allons se sens plus attendre.
The English had captured the vital fortification, known as Les Tourelles, on the south bank of the Loire. Orléans would live or die on its access to supplies. Recapturing Les Tourelles would be key to saving the city.
Commandement in continent. À mon cri, avant.
Orléans had sent for crucial supplies. but English patrols threatened their arrival at the city. If Orléans hoped to receive the supplies, the French would have to clear the road of English raiders.
Soyez à mon cri, avant. Allons ce sens plus attendre. Beijing, ce sera.
The French eliminated the English raiders, granting the supply convoy safe passage into the city. Each time supplies approached Orléans, English raiders would return to guard the road, hoping to plunder the French goods. The supply convoy arrived in the city, providing the French army with much-needed gold. Seeing another supply convoy approaching the city, English raiders took up position on the road. The French needed to eliminate the enemy detachment if they hoped to receive the supplies. Another trade convoy arrived in Orléans with more gold to bolster the army. Another trade convoy arrived in Orléans with more gold to bolster the army.
Derrière moi, Trestus.
Oyez les commandements. Je fais vos commandements.
The French army torched the eastern English fort, securing a crossing to the south bank of the Loire River.
Dictez-moi une Versailles.
Nos soyons. A parler. Bien, dictes vos commandements. Si vous
Durchkämpfen, Chevalier! Front pour un! Truppe de trinque!
The main bridge leading to Orléans had been destroyed by the French to prevent an English onslaught. Jeanne d'Arc had to find another way to cross to the south bank and make her assault on Les Tourelles. Another trade convoy arrived in Orléans with more gold to bolster the army. Les Tourelles was the linchpin in the English siege of Orléans, blocking the main supply route to the city. If Jeanne d'Arc could capture it, Orléans would finally be liberated.
Vos habillement.
Obedecía Candons les commandements.
Another trade convoy arrived in Orléans with more gold to bolster the army. The King's army drove the hated enemy of France from Les Tourelles. With the main road to the city back in French hands, the English abandoned their long siege of Orléans. Celebrating a momentous victory at the head of the French army, Jeanne d'Arc would forever be remembered as the Maid of Orleans. Jeanne d'Arc had liberated Orleans and put the English army to flight. However, as the English retreated, they became an obstacle for Charles the Dauphin. He needed a clear path from Chinon to Reims, where he would be crowned king. Nearing the town of Patay, the English sought to regroup. But Jeanne d'Arc and her French army were closing in. Fleeing the Loire Valley, the English were on the run. As they retreated northwards, a French vanguard was in close pursuit. Caught out of position, the French faced a surprise attack from the English rearguard. A detachment of English archers blocked the road with palings, an effective measure against cavalry. The French vanguard had to clear the road if they were to call in reinforcements. With the road cleared, the French army could safely bring in reinforcements from nearby allies. The French army paid their ally and received a detachment of reinforcements.
Attendez, les croyez prest. L'heure est de besoin.
Allons, l'ennemi nos agouettes.
Si attendons.
Retrayez vos amouets. Prendre, je commande, avant.
Hearing the rallying cry of the English coming from the village of St. Sigmund, the French were alerted to the enemy position. The French recaptured St. Sigmund and prepared to rendezvous with Jeanne d'Arc. But a large English detachment had set up a blockade. So long as that force was in place, the French vanguard could not reach Jeanne. With the English blockade destroyed, the French vanguard rejoiced at the arrival of Jeanne d'Arc and her troops. With their rearguard eliminated,
Right.
The remaining English forces would now seek to escape the valley through the town of Patay. 3 enemy regiments were converging on the town along 3 main roads. Jeanne had either to stop the regiments on the roads or race ahead to fortify Patay itself. As the forces of the valiant Jeanne d'Arc entered the town, the people of Patay rallied to her cause.
Je fais vos commandements. Oh yes, les commandements. Avanti, avant. Si fait que ce sera.
After an intense pursuit and a hard-fought battle, the French crushed the remaining English army, thwarting their desperate retreat. Now the triumphant Jeanne d'Arc could safely lead Charles to Reims for his coronation as King of France. The Battle of Patay was a disaster for the English. The French wiped out their bowmen and drove their forces from the Loire Valley. Now for Jeanne d'Arc and the Dauphin, the way to Reims was clear. The Maid of Orleans rode with the Dauphin through the streets and was at his side when he was finally crowned King Charles VII of France. But less than 2 years later, Jeanne was captured in battle, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy. she spent 6 months locked in a dungeon, awaiting her fate. King Charles, who owed his crown to Jeanne, did nothing to help win her freedom. She was found guilty. On May 30th, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was brought here, to the old market square in Rouen, where she was burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. But what the Maid of Orleans started could not be denied. Her victories were the first in a chain of successes for France's military. Liberty was within reach. Thanks to the leadership of two brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, the French army became experts in the use of artillery, transforming it into a disciplined, modern fighting force. In 1448, King Charles was ready to make a major move against the English. He vowed to retake Normandy. King Charles VII's army would soon have access to the most advanced artillery in Europe, thanks to the master gunners, the Bureau brothers. While the brothers developed their weapons, the king laid plans for their use. He would bring Normandy back under French control. The first phase of the king's plan would give the Bureau brothers time to perfect their cannons. He tasked his army with claiming a base of operations.
Comme il vous plaise. Gretchens vos, nos déguerpissons.
With the town under French control, the Bureau brothers now had the use of the university and of their own siege workshop. Their next goal was to learn all they could about recent innovations in the mixing of the most potent gunpowder. While the army waited for their new weapons, they kept a watchful eye for any English attacks on the town. A party of English soldiers approached the French base, intent on reclaiming the town. The brothers worked tirelessly to cast their gun barrels, but they still needed insight into the latest gunpowder chemistry. Powerful gunpowder recipe with sturdy cast iron gun barrels. At last, cannon production could begin. While the brothers turned out their cannons, culverins, and riboldequins, the French army would bolster themselves for the coming fight.
Or ça, bien vous plaise l'achèvement?
Ici les commandos, nous accomplissons vos ordonnances.
With the mine under French control, the Bureau brothers had access to an abundance of iron for their gun barrels.
Ouais, c'est vidé. Envoyez-moi les commandements.
Reste tous jusqu'au dérameur rond.
After razing the river port, the French soldiers seized a stockpile of shipworthy timber, which could be used for superior cannon frames.
Vos ordonnances. Suivez l'engin, soudard. Dites de nos quelqu'un peine à battre. Ainsi sera fait. Nous avons les commandements reçus. Avant, un 6 mai vont pour la bataille. Ça donc, gardez vos esprits par de verbos.
Advertance. Bien.
Avant, un 6 mai vont pour la bataille.
Boustiliers de l'eau, oui. Vous destriez, déformez vos armes. Juste à l'ennemi.
With the skirmish won, trade could begin with the settlement. others now had every available advantage in producing their guns.
Tout est ordonné. Nos accomplis sont au commandement. Ainsi soit-il. Engin de siège, s'approche. Oui, la partie de toi. Engin de siège, s'approche. Ils vont partir de notre île. Ainsi soit fait. C'est gagné. Ça va tout les commandements. Engin de siège, s'affronter. Engin de siège, ainsi. Nos accomplis sont vos ordonnances. La quintaine est toute terminée.
Je fais votre commandement.
After years of preparation, the time had come for Charles VII to make his move. To take back Normandy, he would need to recapture the stronghold of Rouen, a critical fortress from which the English had been attacking Paris. Rouen walls would face an explosive trial against the mighty force of gunpowder.
Engin, sécurez l'engin de siège. Nos ordres, suivez l'engin, Soudard. Suivez l'engin. Avant, allons.
Ready to launch their final assault on this key English stronghold.
Ils explosent de siège, oui, à part main. Engin de siège, ça faut aller. Engin de siège, ça faut aller. C'est quasi assouvi. Engin, c'est l'heure de trêve. Ça, engin, en la voie. C'est quasi assouvi.
Rouen walls were breached. The French army had at last exposed the heart of the fortress.
Engin de siège, oui, à part main.
Having lost the walls of Rouen, the English made a last stand to hold the city. The French would need to destroy the buildings that had housed the English army and drive out the enemy for good.
Suivez l'engin. Avant, allons.
Oui, chevalier.
Soudard, suivez l'engin, Soudard. Engin de suite. C'est l'heure des grèves. On ne laissera ainsi soit-il. Ainsi sera fait.
With the English scattered and their buildings in ashes, the French had recaptured the critical fortress of Rouen. Charles VII had proven that France was no longer the underdog in the 100 Years' War. After decades of bloody dispute, Normandy was finally back in French hands. Thanks to the explosive force of cannon fire, the French were close to victory in this century-long war. But in a final grasp at power, the English dispatched a fresh army, equipped with their tried and tested longbows. Formigny would be a trial of old versus new, to determine the fate of France. English commander Sir Thomas Kyriel sent a large expedition to crush the French in Normandy. The village of Carentan was directly in their path. Massively outnumbered, the French skirmishers near Carentan would give their lives to weaken the English. Though they fought bravely, the French skirmishers could only slow the English advance. The main body of the French army finally arrived in the river valley. The French now needed to locate and destroy the English army. But they would face a well-entrenched enemy with several local garrisons. The French destroyed the garrison at Briquebec. French forces found a detachment of the English army, attacking the town of Valognes. If they could stop the attack, they might gain valuable resources. With the English attack on Valognes halted, the citizens moved to support the French army.
Nous allons avoir avant. Tornoyons investis. Avant, c'est une heureuse victoire. Je vais derrière de l'artillerie.
The English base at Saint-Sauveur fell to the French forces, but the enemy army was still at large. The French forces located Kirill's English army at a river crossing near the town of Formigny. Several of the Bureau brothers' heavy guns and other forces arrived to help.
Dites-nous quelqu'un t'en a battu. Engin de siège, ça faut aller. Ça, engin, en l'avouer. Les engins...
Voyez bien, si sera fait selon... Je cesse ma besogne.
Even with their cannons, the French faced the difficult task of engaging the well-positioned English army.
Engin de siège, ça, engin, en l'avouer. Très bien. C'est une engin de siège, parti. Tout le temps.
Voyez bien.
The French attacks succeeded in drawing the English front line out of position and across the river. Suffering losses, the English front line retreated back across the river. Received word that their Breton allies had arrived with their knights and horsemen. Now the two armies could coordinate. The Bretons saw an opportunity to attack the English from the back. As the Bretons attacked, the English had no choice but to pivot their front line, opening their flanks to attack from the French. Beset by the French and Bretons, the English beat a hasty retreat toward Formigny. The English survivors entered Formigny. The French would have to take this town to secure victory. With the last English army destroyed and the gates of Formigny thrown open, the French force in Normandy was victorious. Their well-organized forces and superior firepower had brought the arduous 100 Years' War closer to its conclusion. Formigny. The roar of cannon fire sounded the death knell for England's ambitions in France. King Charles and the Bureau brothers did not let up on the offensive, and in 1453, the English retreated across the Channel. France was finally at peace. More than 100 years had passed since the first English chevauchés had scorched the land. The iconic French knights who fought in those early days would not have recognized their own military a century later. The English longbow, once the scourge of France, was no match for French artillery in the last years of the war. And by 1453, France's border looked very different, growing to encompass territories once claimed by England and their allies. After enduring a century of conflict, France emerged as a transformed nation. The country and its people had persevered and unified into a kingdom that could defend itself. Against all odds, France had won the 100 Years' War.